Today we are going to learn how to decorate this set of cookies that I made for my family's Thanksgiving. First up is this pumpkin cutter, this beloved pumpkin cutter by Kaleidacuts. It has taken the cookie world by storm. It is a beautiful cutter, beautiful design. So for this, I am going to be doing a crackle technique on the pumpkin. I call it the pokey poke. I don't think it's actually officially called the crackle technique, but that's what we're going to call it. I am doing a single consistency outline and flood for this first step. It's a thicker flood. You could certainly do this technique with two consistency outline and flood. It's just your preference and what you need for the set. I am also flooding in sections here so I can get definition between the three sections of the pumpkin. Flooding in sections just means that I'm literally flooding in alternating sections, allowing that to crust, and then piping the remaining alternate sections so that you get the definition in between the sections of the pumpkin instead of just one blob. The next step after you flood is that you want to allow the icing to just crust over. I use a dehydrator, so for me that takes about 15 minutes in the dehydrator. Without a dehydrator, just using a table fan, my guess would be somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. Often I will kind of just sacrifice a corner of one cookie and take it out when I think it's done. When I say crust, that means that the surface has just hardened. Think about it like a lake. The top of the lake freezes first before the inside. So we just want the frozen top of the lake just enough so that when you poke into it, as you can see I'm doing here, it cracks the surface. If I were to poke a little sooner than what it looks like now, it will look more like indentations than cracks. And that's certainly a look too. And if you'd rather have just indentations instead of the crack, you can take it out sooner. For me, I personally like the kind of geometric crack that it gives. Something else to keep in mind when you're doing the cracking, poking. By the way, I'm just using the end of a paintbrush, nothing fancy, but I also like to use the modeling chocolate tools that have a ball at the end because that gives you kind of a bigger rounded crack depending on the surface that you're working with and how big or small it is. But what I was saying, something to keep in mind as you're doing the crack is that you don't want to totally puncture the surface. And when I was doing it, I was certainly not perfect, and sometimes I would puncture the surface. And you know that you've punctured it when you get some icing on the end of the tool that you're using to poke with. It's an art of just barely cracking the surface, but not poking all the way through. So I enjoy doing this part. I find it very meditative. You can certainly poke in a very methodical way, or you can do it slightly more haphazard like I'm doing here. Again, if you're unsure of time, I would say start with 15 minutes, take it out. You can see the difference in the surface. It's no longer wet looking. It is clearly starting to dry. It's possible for this to dry too much and then you can't do this technique. So start with 15 minutes, then try 20, 25. It just depends on kind of the environment you're in and how fast the icing is drying. So for this next piece, also you can see that I have sketched out the shape first with an edible marker. I don't typically do this, but this was my first time using this cutter and I was a little nervous about the design. So I actually sketched this on. I think I might have used my projector and projected the image of the cutter's design onto the cookie and sketched it that way. It's also possible I just freehanded it. I'm not sure. Whatever you're most comfortable with. For that small bit on the stem, I did use two consistencies, so one to outline, and then I used a true flood consistency. You'll see later that it actually cratered a bit, so I wish that I had used a thicker consistency to do a pressure piped stem instead of just a normal outline and flood, but you live, you learn. Next time I know what I'm gonna do. The little orange twiggy things, whatever those are piped with what looks like something between a soft and a medium peak piping consistency. This here is a soft peak piping consistency, and I'm going to use this to pressure pipe these leaves. That's what I was saying I wish I had done with the stem. And pressure piping this means I'm using a thicker consistency that's not going to settle on its own, but you can see with the help of either the tip of my bag or a scribe, I can get it to settle. And the reason why I'm using this for the leaves is because if I had used a normal flood consistency, it would crater. Cratering is natural. It always happens with royal icing. I believe it's because of the weight of the meringue powder. It pulls down inside the liquid, and the more liquid, the thinner the icing, the more the less stable the icing is. So the heavier that meringue powder is, and the more it pulls down. But if it's thicker, it's more stable. There's more mass to it. If I'm using the right word, I'm sorry, science people who know science. But I just love the beautiful poof that this gets. There are other ways to avoid craters, like there's the squiggle technique, which is what I attempted to use on the stem, and I find that it doesn't always work, so I would actually just rather use a thicker consistency like this. Again, this is a soft peak, so soft peak means that when you stick your spoon in the bowl of icing, pull it out upright, the tip of the icing will completely fall over onto itself, but it will still maintain its shape. So whereas a medium peak will just halfway fall over, but very clearly still has a defined shape to it. This we want to completely fall over. It's the kind of thickness that with encouragement, it will settle. So once I've piped these leaves, I allow those details to crust just enough so that I can then pipe these final details on top with piping consistency. This looks like somewhere between a soft and a medium peak. I'm using a cookie swivel. I don't know if it's really called a cookie swivel, but mine is from LC Sweets, and I'll link that in the description of this video. I don't always use cookie swivels. I only use them on a design where it's really necessary. I find it necessary when doing something like this where I'm constantly needing to change the angle of the cookie to match the angle of my piping hand. Most of the time I just leave the cookie on the dehydrator tray. So that is the pumpkin. Up next, we have the Give Thanks plaque. This is a pretty large cookie, which is why I decided to do a 2 consistency outline and flood. I like to do that with larger cookies because the thicker your icing, the faster it will crust, and you just have a little more time to flood a larger cookie with a thinner flood. I also like to do 2 consistencies for a hand lettered plaque like this that has tons of little nooks and crannies around the edges, because I personally just get a better border and outline of the shape if I'm doing 2 consistencies. Now, I know I just said that I like to do 2 consistencies on a larger cookie so I can make the flood thinner, but as you can see, this is not a thin flood. Whoops. So I'm going to show you what I do to help a thicker flood settle. The first thing is I'm using that scribe to help it all kind of blend together a little bit better. You can see the very edges have started to crust. I am tapping right there, and now I am shaking. Friends, be careful, be careful. Hold your cookie as flat as you possibly can, so you don't spill over the edge with icing. There I am popping some air bubbles. In this moment, I'm really wishing I had made a thinner flood, but here we are. So the next step is I have let that icing crust, and now I am doing a splatter technique. I love the splatter technique. I often do it with metallics like gold and silver, and I also like to do it a lot with white. When I'm using white, I prefer to use edible paint over using gel food coloring. I just find with white it's a little bit of a different beast. So I've linked that paint in the description of this video. And I like to put a good amount on the end of a brush and then tap it. Some people like to use their finger to pull up the bristles of the brush, but that just seems like such a mess to me, so I always tap it. And I find that when you tap it, it always goes kind of in one direction. So I was trying to accomplish maximum splatter on this cookie. So you'll see me turning it around every once in a while to get some different angles. This splatter, the beauty of this is that it's supposed to look messy. So there's less perfection needed, and I love techniques like that. So the execution it's not as important, and you can cover up maybe if you have any air bubbles or mistakes somewhere in the flood. Bring in that splatter. The next thing that I'm doing is actually the lettering. Now, this is a hand lettered plaque by Kaleidocuts. Heather over at Kaleidocuts does her own lettering. That means it's her intellectual property, this lettering. By purchasing the cutter, I purchased the ability to also use the lettering. It's really important for artists of all kind to respect their intellectual property. So only use this lettering if you have actually purchased the cutter. I just take a screenshot of the image on her website and I project that onto the cookie. Sometimes she does actually have the lettering separately to purchase in an SVG file, and you can use that on any cutter that you want. So lettering consistency is definitely the hardest consistency to get because there's very little wiggle room for what works and what doesn't work. And this is a soft peak. It is a good balance of an icing that keeps its shape, but it can also kind of smooth and settle out if you encourage it to with a scribe or the tip of your bag. What do I mean by soft peak? The way that I measure this is how I pull the spoon out of the bowl of icing. So I will take a spoonful and then put the spoon upright in my hand, and A soft peak means that the tip of the icing falls over onto itself but still maintains its shape, and it kind of has a roundness to the edges. A medium peak is going to have slightly more defined edges to that flop, if any of this makes sense. At some point I do hope to do a video on consistencies. I'm insanely proud of this consistency here. It's one of my favorite that I've ever done. And this kind of lettering is called pressure piping lettering, which means I'm varying the pressure on my bag. I apply more pressure on downstrokes and then I release the pressure just enough to pipe these thinner lines on the upstrokes. This is definitely the hardest. They're all lettering is hard, but this one I find particularly hard, especially if you're new to the concept of pressure piping. It's a lot of things going on in your brain at one time. So give yourself some grace when you're trying to learn how to do this lettering. It took me a lot of tries to get to a good place, and I still don't always get it right. So that is this beautiful plaque. So moving on, we have the pumpkin pie, and again you can see that I sketched out with an edible marker the shape because this was my first time using this, and again I was a little nervous. So this I definitely just freehanded. Here I am using, it looks like piping consistency. Again, next time I do this I will probably use a soft peak piping consistency for this section instead, just to get a little better poof. But I put this in the dehydrator right away and it helped it to crust and stay relatively poofy, which is good. So I'm letting that crust over again so I can do this flooding in sections and get definition in between the sections. And this is a single consistency outline and flood. This is one way you can see that I'm doing here, that you can join two sections when doing an outline, flooding in sections. You can either do what I just did, which is to drop a line next to it first to get that good seam, or you can do the pressured flood right next to the line, right next to the next section. I think the first way I did it is probably easier if you don't have quite as steady of hands, because the hardest part about flooding in sections is getting a nice seam in between the two sections. Let's see what I do here. So I'm going to outline the edge first, and then how do I join the sections? I think I do, yep, I do the line again. So this gives me a nice seam, and when I go to flood in the rest of the cookie, I don't get close to that seam because I want to make sure that that maintains its integrity. If you do have to use a scribe after you flood, when you're doing flooding in sections, make sure you stay a few millimeters away from the seam, because if you get too close, it's going to make the seam between the two sections look wonky and not smooth. It's probably the biggest mistake that people make when they're doing flooding in sections. So I let all that crust, and I'm going to do one of my favorite techniques here, which is the bear technique. Some people, I think, pipe icing on the side and dab into that and then go onto the surface of the cookie, but I prefer to just pipe right onto the surface of the cookie and dab away. Now, I honestly kind of hate doing the bear technique this way, where I have already flooded the other sections, and I don't like doing it this way because then I have to be very careful of the sections next to it so that I don't accidentally get some of this icing onto the other sections it's not supposed to be on. For me, the ideal way to do bear is I would have done this section first, done the bear technique, and then flooded the other sections around it. So I also get just the cleanest coverage on the bare technique, but this is good enough, and I just have to take a little bit more time to be a little more careful. And here I'm actually going to use a different brush so I can get closer to the seam. I know you're sitting here wondering when this part is going to end, but I wanted you to see exactly how I did this and how much time it takes. So the sped up videos are misleading. Here, this is a slanted cut on a tipless bag, and I think this is beautiful and voluptuous, but it creates a huge opening on this bag, which is why these crust pieces are so gigantic. It's a lot of icing that's coming out of that bag. That's the one downside to doing a slant on a tipless bag, is that it's going to create a pretty big opening if you do a bigger slant. So there is my nice big dollop of whipped cream, and that is the pumpkin pie. Up next is this plaque of sorts. This is another Kaleidocuts cutter. The pumpkin pie was also Kaleidocuts. I believe this entire set is Kaleidocuts. I love her stuff. So here I am outlining and flooding. Circles are the bane of most cookiers' existence. They are very hard to pipe well. Here I'm about to use a scribe momentarily. I'm not sure what I was doing here. I guess I was letting it just sit for a second. There is the scribe. So using that scribe to help it all settle out. Not one of my finest floods. I wonder why I didn't flood this cookie completely, but I digress. I'm pumping some diamond dust on here, which in the end, you can't really see this. So you can completely leave out the diamond dust. Popping a bubble. Real life people, I get air bubbles too. This is pure gel food coloring. This is the AmeriColor Wedgwood. If you're going to do this, you'll want to brush the cookie with cornstarch after it's had a chance to dry, so that it kind of helps set the food gel and doesn't come off on your fingers or the bag. This looks closer to a medium peak to me, because you can still kind of see the indentations in these little leaf type shapes that I'm doing here. And again, here I am using my cookie swivel to help me out with the angles here. You can see that I'm using the tip of my bag to encourage the icing to settle. Now, if I had more patience, I would probably use my scribe even after doing that, to further encourage the icing, but I only have so much patience, my friends. And this was enough for me. So I am going to do a detail on the leaves after I let them crust that kind of masks that little bit of unsettled icing in the middle. So I've let those leaves crust, and now here I am doing that detail I talked about. I'm all about coming up with designs that hide your mistakes. And I don't necessarily need to look at this as a mistake, but I was really hoping for a cleaner poof on my leaves, so I wanted to do something to kind of mask that. I also just think it looks nice. Up next is the lettering, and I am using a projector, of course. And yes, this cookie was for me, which is why it has my name on it. This lettering was actually custom lettering done by a good friend, Bossy Brushstrokes. I was doing this set for my family, and I wanted to have some beautifully mastered custom lettering of everyone's names. I'm doing the same kind of lettering I did on the Give Thanks plaque, which is the pressure piping. This was also a beautiful consistency here. And there we have it, the grace. And up next, and I believe last in this set, is the couch. Again, I sketched the shape of the couch, my first time using this cutter, another Kaleido cutter. And for these smaller sections, actually for all of the sections, I am using just a straight flood. And again, you live, you learn. I wish I had used the soft peak to do pressure piping. You'll see that these sections crater a bit after they've dried. And I just, again, I could have done the squiggles. I don't find a lot of success doing the squiggles first. I find the best success using the thickest icing possible for the application. So this whole couch is about flooding in sections. So flooding alternate sections, allowing them to crust, and then going in for the rest. So I'm going to realize in a second that I have some dangerous attempt at overflow on the side. Not good, my friends. So I'm going to take a scribe, and while it's still wet, I just pull off that excess icing. Then I go back with my scribe and help the little peak settle, and no one needs to know. No one needs to know. It's all about just learning how to roll with the punches and fix your mistakes. I certainly get overflood. Probably one cookie per batch. Sometimes I make it out without any overflood of any sort, but I tend to tempt fate, as you can see when I when I ice cookies. I also do a lot of single consistency outline and flood, and I flood right to the edge of the cookie, and I have a pretty heavy hand when I flood. So it's a miracle that I haven't had more overflood than I have. And the lettering I'm going to be doing on this cookie was, again, lettering done by Kaleidocuts for this cutter. So I purchased the cutter so I can use the lettering. She and I actually worked on this lettering together. I believe the theme of this couch was originally Netflix and chill, and I wanted something Thanksgiving food coma themed. So the lettering is food coma. I have no regrets. I'm going to admit here that this is not my most proud lettering. I couldn't quite get the consistency right. I'm pretty sure that I rebagged this icing and I just got to the point where I gave up. It was good enough, but not quite what the green and the orange was of those other cookies I was using. But sometimes with cookies with royal icing, you just need to go with good enough. Now for this, I'm fairly certain that I actually rebagged this icing again so that I could have a smaller tip. Now, a trick if you accidentally cut a larger tip, or you intentionally cut a larger tip and you need a smaller one afterwards, you can pop the original bag into another bag, cut that tip smaller, and there you go. I find it's a little harder to handle, so I don't do that unless I have to, but it's a great quick trick if you need two different size openings in your bag. And there we have it, my friends. That is the food coma couch. And that is the entire beautiful set of Thanksgiving cookies that I made for my family. Hope you make them for yours too.